So this is a very special opportunity for us to have a conversation with somebody who has been important to me personally, but also important to the social movement here in the United States and also internationally for many, many years. This is a conversation that we're having with students who are enrolled in social movements and political protest here at George Mason University, which is a course that we offer regularly. And we are in a unit this week in which we're taking on the question of the legacy of the 1960s movements and how those movements carried on from the 60s to the 70s, the 80s, the 90s, and even to today, right? So it really seemed like a very good opportunity to take that and to also take on the questions that are being addressed at the Nexus of Teach-Ins here at George Mason University and also at a dozen other institutions across the Americas, from Argentina to Puerto Rico, Mexico, across the United States and Canada, and to turn to Richard Flacks, who not only is one of the most prominent social movement scholars, frankly, of this field, has emerged since the late 70s and early 80s, and he was involved in social movement scholarship as a young member of the faculty at the University of Chicago and the University of California, Santa Barbara in the late 60s and early 70s. Did really important work looking at the legacies of the 60s generation, the motivations of people who became involved in the movement of the 1960s, but also to talk with him about what we can learn from that movement as people who are interested in the question of system change and who are interested in particular in what people who are working with academics, working with people in universities or who are located in universities and colleges, what we can learn from the lessons of the 60s and beyond in terms of how we build a democratic society by building democratic universities. He was one of the two elders in the room in Port Huron in Michigan, 1962, when the Port Huron Statement was drafted. Dick and his wife, Mickey Flacks, who were a real powerhouse couple in Santa Barbara, where I did my doctorate for many years. I recommend among the many books that Dick has either authored or co-authored is their memoir, Making Blintzes, Making Revolution, and I'm probably getting the order there. Yeah, Dick is shaking his head, but I recommend it. And he's also author of many other books and articles, some of which students here have read this week. So Dick, thank you for taking the time to join us. Really looking forward to what you have to share today, and I'm looking forward to the discussion. Please welcome Dick Flacks.
Hi, so thanks a lot for inviting me. For a lot of reasons, I'm pleased to do this, partly my connection with you personally, but I've been a supporter and interested in the Next System project, Gar Alperovitz's work, for many, many years. And that interest really traces back to what I want to take off from here, which you didn't. In 1962, June, in Port Huron, Michigan, I and my wife were part of a group of maybe 60 people who gathered. Port Huron was the site of a kind of retreat center run by the United Auto Workers Union. And we met for a week with the intention of creating a new national student organization, which was called the Students for a Democratic Society. And the main work we did that week, and it was almost 24/7 for several days, was the writing of a manifesto for our generation, which came to be called the Port Huron Statement. I don't know, is that part of the reading list here or some of it?
What? Yeah.
And I'm mentioning that not because that's the most important thing to mention, but because it's a good takeoff point for the theme that Ben was suggesting, which is the phrase he used, democratic university in a democratic society. I think there are two things about the Port Huron Statement that really were, in my mind, innovative intellectually and politically at that point, and continue to be worth remembering and investigating. One was the key phrase in the Port Huron statement was participatory democracy. We were looking for a new way of describing what you're now calling the next system. What was the vision of a better society that was animating for us as we got together, we people in our early 20s, late teens, college students and graduate students is what I was. What was driving us? And this phrase, which I won't talk about the origin of it, although it has a history, participatory democracy. And we defined it in the Port Huron Statement as meaning that society should be structured so that the people affected by decisions have a voice in the making of their decisions. And that sounds rather abstract, but to me, it's been extremely useful as a way of criticizing, examining, and thinking about how institutions operate and how the society operates. The question you're asking when you think participatory democracy is, where did the rules, where did the uh, governing principles of an institution or of a relationship come from? Did the people who are affected and have to live by those rules have a say in how those rules were created, or did they not? Democracy, in the fullest sense, means they have a direct voice. They're part of the creation of the means by which people live. So that's the key idea of the Port Huron Statement. And to my mind, it embraced many of the what I in those years was calling 19th century alternative to capitalism ideologies like socialism, anarchism. Uh, we didn't want to call ourselves those labels. Uh, we thought a new terminology was required, and um, I think we were right, but I'm really amazed by the revival of the word socialism as something positive, something people are looking for, democratic socialism as part of the framework of understanding what an alternative future would look like. Uh, the second point, and the one I want to take off from, that's important in the Port Huron statement, is the idea that if you want to change the society, the university is an important arena for generating that change. And the statement language develops some of the reasons why we were thinking that. That was a new idea at the time. I mean, the university was not considered the center of the world. Uh, if you have any influence of Marx on you, you don't think of the university as the place where struggle would occur. It's the factories, it's the workplace, it's the streets. How could the university be relevant to this? Well, uh, we thought the society, one part of the way the society was developing was that knowledge, technical knowledge, science, research based knowledge was more and more central in shaping the entire economy of the society. That was one important point. But that also the struggle that the university could be a place where new ideas could circulate at a time in history, the early 60s, when very little in the larger society was pointing in the direction of alternatives. And so the university as a freer space, as a place where ideas from the past and new ideas coming into being could be studied, could be debated, could be researched, was what part of what we were looking for. Uh, and also, as students, we were feeling subordinated and powerless with respect to the administrative bureaucracy and the way both education and the institutions itself were organized at the time. So the idea of applying participatory democracy in the university, of giving students a voice in the decisions that affected them, was one of the really key feelings that was present at that time in the early 60s among some students like us. And at Port Huron in that meeting, that was an important idea. So how did that work out? That's relevant to the next system stuff that we're talking about here at this teach-in. I think that's what I'm going to emphasize is the positive dimensions of that history, and I'll try to be brief because I'd love to get questions if we can get time for that. The one important thing that came from Port Huron pretty quickly within SDS, as it grew as an organization that represented eventually tens of thousands of students by the later part of the 60s. But in the first few years, there wasn't much visibility of SDS, which in a way was a good thing because it gave us time to reach out and organize people in person, not through the media. Try to build chapter by chapter this kind of organization that would really be serious about changing the university and changing society. And one of the key ideas that emerged at that time was what we called student power. Um, there was Black power. There were other phrases using the word power that all of them to us represented a kind of way of putting the concept of participatory democracy. Student power would mean students would have a voice in making the rules that govern their behavior, including in the dormitories. At that time, students were subjected to curfews and to dress rules and to really gender-based uh, 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 suppression of normal impulses and interests. Uh, in loco parentis was a phrase in higher education then that the university was acting in place of parents. But in many cases, our parents were more liberal than the university's own rules. Students demanded change, and it wasn't really based on whether you were left wing or right wing. Students just felt oppressed by that kind of regime. So that was the most immediate democratization uh, kind of feeling that spread on college campuses, student power on that level. But pretty quickly, numbers of people, both students and some faculty and other intellectuals, were saying students should have a voice in the educational process itself. The classes should be organized to hear what students themselves are eager to learn. Students should be able to bring to the class uh, uh, their own contributions to shaping what the class is about. That student learning is most effective when there's an active participation in that process. And part of what we as leftists were saying on that in that regard was that much was missing in the curriculum that we were faced with on the typical college campus. Where was Karl Marx? That was the most obvious example. There was when I was in college and in graduate school, there was almost no Marx in the menu or in the reading list or in the syllabus or curriculum, even in the sociology department when I was a graduate student. Uh, but that's just one example. Whole ranges of ideas and of topics and of ways of structuring courses that we could imagine would be beneficial in really connecting our work in our classes with what was going on in the society. All of that was missing. And so student voice, as we understood it, would include uh, giving us a chance to articulate on campus that kind of demand or that kind of vision. But another thing was missing from the curriculum that really became consequential when people began to realize it, which was what was the story being told about history and about the nature of American society. It was a white story. It was a story based on those who had won domination in the history. Where were the voices of people of color? Where were the voices of the slaves and the people whose ancestors were slaves? Where are the voices of the Native Americans? Where were the voices of immigrant groups? Uh, coming here and helping to shape the society. Not only their voices, but their stories, their history, their culture, not represented in the early 60s in almost any part of the college curriculum. So when you start thinking about what were the battles that could be fought on the university, that was obviously one that was important. But it wasn't just the curriculum. Where were the people of color? When I came to UCSB in the late 1960s, 95% of the student body was white suburban people from Southern California. They were interesting people to me because I had never really met a lot of kids from that background, and I was fascinated to teach them, and that was the time of the counterculture. Everyone at UCSB was experimenting with alternatives in their lifestyle, so it was not a time of conformity. On the contrary, but there were almost no students of color on the campus. There were student activists who were Black and who were Latino, and they really began to get active just at the time that I arrived here. And today, only about a third of the student body is white. The majority of students in the University of California are students of color. UCSB is about 35% Latino, uh, and it is a far more dynamic student body and institution these many years later, in part because of a transformed student body. Uh, but that's just part of the reason that students wanted to come here, students of color, and to other UC campuses, was because of one of the fulfillments of the agenda that I said started in the 60s, was the creation of what we came to call ethnic studies programs. There would be no Black studies in higher education. There would be no Chicano studies or Asian American studies were it not for student activism that began to demand that those kinds of things were in the curriculum. And that demand really was, in a way, anticipated, I think, by some of what was said in the Port Huron statement. And not just the studies, not just the curriculum, as I said, but the transformation of the admissions uh, model in the university over a number of years of conflict and struggle to change the demographic of the student body. Much success in that, even though affirmative action was done away with in California in the late 90s. Other measures that have been taken that I could develop at length that has related to the kind of demographic diversity that I mentioned, and also demands for faculty diversity with respect to minorities. Feminist studies and feminist demands came out of the same impulse later in the 60s and into the 70s. And so we now have feminist studies, women's studies. We have many more women in higher education than there were in the 1960s. All of these, I'm suggesting, were changes in the university that, in a way, the Port Huron statement was hoping to happen. Of course, we didn't know the full nature of what that would look like, uh, but uh, the student activism that flowed from that, and that flowed from the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement, Latino movement, was transformative in those particular ways. And I want to claim that those were real changes. They were significant changes, not only on university, but meaningful for the larger society. Student power uh, kind of vision also meant a voice in the governance of the university. And that, I don't think we ever imagined that students would have an equal voice in governance, but shared governance, participation in governance. And at the University of California, there are students now, student seats on the Board of Regents, the governing body of the University of California, always has there are, I think, 2 students at any given time sitting on the Board of Regents. That doesn't seem like a lot of power. It isn't, because it's a board with 25 members. But the student voice on that Regents has made a difference on a number of issues. Uh, and Similarly, on individual campuses like mine, there are many campus committees that make policy where students have representation. The trouble with student participation in that kind of governance is that students have a short half-life, you might say, on the campus. Uh, when I was teaching, uh, gave courses deliberately designed to educate students who wanted to be participate in the governance of the campus, gave them a sense of in depth of the history of higher education, of this particular institution, how the institution worked. Pretty in-depth effort to almost train students for democracy was what I had in mind. And my practice as a faculty member was very much influenced by having been to Port Huron and helping to write that statement. So that's one big change in university uh, in terms of democracy, participatory democracy that I've just outlined. There are other, however, important transformations. Sociology, which is my discipline and Ben's discipline, uh, it's it has been transformed over the past number of decades by people who had been student activists, who became members of the discipline, became faculty, became scholars in sociology. The sociology of these days is far more embracing of the recognition of the need for fundamental social reform. Sociology, when I was in graduate school, tended to uh, be what we would call functionalist in its analysis. That is, uh, understanding the way society worked is the way it needed to work because that's how societies work. It was sort of hard to imagine within those frameworks any idea of a new system or alternative system making any sense. Well, sociology as over these years of decades much broadened its scope in terms of both the theoretical foundations and the methodological approaches now in the discipline, so much so that people now studying sociology, whether you're a major or graduate student, take for granted what we 50 years ago would have thought were battles that had to be won, that we didn't have uh, these opportunities for the topics and approaches and theories that are now taken for granted in the discipline. It's not that the discipline is great and wonderful, but some of the things that we were most interested in changing uh, to some degree did happen in terms of the content and nature of what the discipline was about. Then another area of university reform has to do with how the university operates in connection to the wider world. For example, the universities of the 60s were very much integrated into the Pentagon military research, including a lot of classified and secret research going on college campuses. Much of the protest of the 60s was protest against those kinds of connections. Um, and that battle, I mean, the most dramatic, again, University of California, was that the University of California was the administrative body for the Livermore Laboratories, which was the place where atomic weapons were produced. So the University of California, one of its enterprises was making atomic weapons. The battle against trying to break that connection has gone on for many years. Uh, some change in that relationship has happened. I'm not actually even up to date on what that is, but that's been an ongoing debate. But there's many other nefarious, you might say, connections that became topics of debate and struggle over these years that were connections to military, to the CIA, to undercover U.S. operations in the third world, so to speak, and then corporate influences and control, ongoing struggle, and with ups and downs in all of that. But the fact that those are now recognized as topics, and that universities can actually use their investment policies as an instrument for social justice is now a much more accepted and understood idea than I think it was. Then it took a long time to get that recognized. Well, I'm being very positive about the change, but there's no reason to be all that positive given what's going on right now, which is a very deliberate and conscious effort by the Trump administration and its allies in the wider society to actually reverse almost all of what I've been talking about, to change the universities back into something that is much more a tool of ruling ideologies, conservative ideologies, and actually of white supremacy. And that is the battle now that we're confronting. And I'm not going to go into it, but just to say, having had this belief, when you get to be my age, you want to believe that the life that you've led, if it's been one of social change, can point to results. And I am quite proud of everything that I just said as being some things that I had some role in. But I at the same time, realized I was getting quite complacent about that, assuming that the universities had permanently moved in certain directions that could be built upon for really productive futures. Now I'm much more worried, much more anxious, and I think many people are with great justification about what this new kind of situation will be that we're facing. Can I stop there? We
I
have
think
time
that
for dialogue. Is that good?
was perfect. You touched on so much that we read for this week. The students also read Who Rules Columbia. So that report, which was one of many when you're talking about corporate influence in the university and so on.
Right.
And, yeah, I saw your people wanted to apply. So please do if you'd like to. I want to apologize that I had been, I was sort of in the middle of class and, I have revolution on the mind much of the time, but Dick and Mickey's memoir is actually making history, making blitzes.
Yeah, I meant to correct that.
I know,
There's no way people could get a book with the title you mentioned, but
yeah.
the real title is Making History, Making Blintzes, which we thought was pretty clever. But you'll see why if you read the book, why that
Never had a
history.
blitz, or maybe it will inspire you to have a blitz as well. Uh,
Yeah.
Really looking forward to the discussion here. I know we have a lot of questions in the room. There may be some questions online too. What I'm going to do is I'm going to take up to 3 questions at a time, right? And I'll try to help make sure that I remind you of those so that you don't have to keep track of them all as well, Dick, and so that we can get those out. And who would like to start? Who's got one they'd like to put forward? Be somebody online too. You were all writing questions down, so what do you have over here?
Well, it was while he was discussing participatory democracy, and I'm wondering if you'd ever look to Switzerland's model of participatory democracy and how they operate.
Excellent. Could you hear that?
No.
Okay, so I'll repeat back. That's fine. It's understandable. So the question was about participatory democracy and Switzerland's model of participatory direct democracy, and whether that, how that's influenced you, what your understanding of it, and also maybe whether that was something you guys were even thinking about. I'm just adding to your question.
Did you say Switzerland?
Switzerland, yeah, Switzerland. So we had a question about Switzerland. And,
So I'll just confess that I don't really know anything about Switzerland's. So I don't think it was that much of an influence. I mean, since you're asking about influence, uh, I've written about this, what I'm about to say, which is the real most important single intellectual influence on Port Huron statement was American pragmatism as articulated by John Dewey and other early 20th century pragmatists. Why? Because Tom Hayden and other SDS activists at the University of Michigan were students of a young philosophy professor named Arnold Kaufman, who was very much a pragmatist, very powerful as a teacher. And he's the one who coined the phrase participatory democracy. But if you read John Dewey on democracy, you'll see he used the same language that you can find in the Port Huron Statement. It's quite amazing. And another channel of intellectual influence of the same kind came from the great and prematurely deceased sociologist C. Wright Mills, who's someone whose work I still consider formative from anything that I'm doing. Mills wrote most of his sociology in the 50s during a time of otherwise great intellectual conservatism. He wrote books with titles like The Power Elite, and he was very much a pragmatist. And I say that because I think that is a very good and deep well of thinking that is rooted in the American experience, pragmatism as a philosophical position. And it has a lot more radical implications than I think sometimes has been recognized. So I think I became a John Deweyite at Port Huron without fully realizing it. But so anyway, it's not Switzerland. It's certain streams of political thinking, of political philosophy in the United States that I think is the most important direct influence on how the Port Huron Statement, how that language that's in the statement came to be, and some of the principles that are articulated came to be. They came through that process that I just described. If anyone cares, I would say in talking about next system, it's not irrelevant to go back to that kind of thinking in the early 20th century when there was a lot of utopian kind of thinking and alternative thinking that we need to revive.
And I'll say, Dick, that C. Wright Mills has come into this course quite a bit, as you might expect. John Dewey briefly, and also in relation to sort of relationship between pragmatism and critical realism. So even though it's an undergraduate class, we got into social movement scholarship and epistemologies, philosophies of science, and there are a number of people here who are from the public sociology seminar in our graduate program as well, who have read Dewey as well. So just wanted to let you know that. I'll also note that Omar, who is here, could actually tell you quite a bit about direct democracy in Switzerland. He worked at the Next Constitutions Research Lab, and it's one of the cases that we've been working on. But yeah, thank you for that question. Other questions? Who else has another question? Oh, there's one in the chat. Okay, that's great. So my question to Professor Flacks, I'll pull this up. You were talking about a diverse group of university students. Do the current frameworks of university education, can they actively engage with those groups to uphold and promote social justice, especially at the time when corporations controlling politics and the rise of right-wing agendas in different corners of the world, including the US? So what then must we do, Dick, in terms of the question that you left us with? And thank you, Ephraim.
Well, I don't know, I'm not able to say what we must do, but I think that, I guess my feeling very much is that students now really do well if they understand the legacy of student activism that they are inheriting and build upon it, learn from what was done in the past, and not assume. Well, let me put it this way. That legacy says you have rights on campus that you need to defend. They're not, it's not simply a hierarchical top-down undemocratic institution. It is got embedded in its history, and of course, different colleges have different degrees of this democracy in their history. But claiming those rights rather than cynically saying, oh, the system is rigged, we can't do anything about it, is the way a lot of social change begins. To realize you have the rights and to figure out how to advance those, defend those, expand those. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's I guess the best way I can put it. And I'll say one thing: affirmative action was the conservative Nixon administration response to the kind of demands that were boiling up about more, broadening access in higher education and and opening up the doors of the ivory tower to students from all classes and racial and ethnic backgrounds and gender background and opening up academic employment in the same way. So affirmative action was the policy framework for doing that. And what that meant was, let's give institutions the right to select outside of their conventional uh, admissions procedures and policies, make special efforts to select people, women and minority people who were qualified, but who were not necessarily going to uh, pass through the filters that were then in place, like the SAT and other kinds of tools like that, like legacy admissions and all the ways in which people were excluded should be abolished or allowed exceptions to for affirmative action. And that was, not really a solution to the full realization of equality in higher education, but it was something that people worked within for a number of decades. And I think now that the courts have decided that that's not the right way to go, we could say, well, we're going to slide back into the past of white supremacy in higher education, or we're going to uh, work even harder to figure out how to really open those doors. And we could go into a lot about what was done
Well, some of
at
those
the
demands.
University of California, but I'm not going to do that now. Yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, so some of those demands were open admissions, right? And some of those were won in some institutions, right?
Yeah, it depends, yes. And to really just scrutinize what especially for public colleges and university, what is this for? What is this place for? And who is best served by it? I've done actual empirical research that shows that students who are academically motivated in high school but come from very disadvantaged backgrounds are likely to be more academically engaged in college than the students who come from with educated parents and suburban high schools and all those things that are supposed to give you advantages. And it, it just seems like the University of California has moved even without affirmative action in this interesting direction where the student body is now really not dominated by white suburban students at all. And more than half the students at the university are either of directly immigrants or their parents are immigrants. And there is no politics in California opposing that. There's no movement that says the university should be serving Americans rather than immigrants. That's not something you hear anymore. So I don't know. I usually want to emphasize the positive in these kind of discussions. So I don't want to overdo that at all because there's still much to be done. Yeah.
And JMU to some extent is sort of like that too, in terms of our admission rates and so on. So it's a different kind of model than a lot of other institutions.
Yeah.
But yeah, look to California, look to what shared governance looks like in California, look to the CUNY system in New York City. But also, as you were saying earlier, look to the demands of the movement in the 1960s that were not won. The demands for popular universities, for true shared governance, right? And as you pointed out, what we've been living with was a compromise at the time that has come under attack. Other questions that people have, and I just want to note also that IPROM is part of the student movement and movement of attorneys as well in Bangladesh on the revolution that just happened this past year. So his question, I know, is also, I think, there's been own research and experience. Other questions that people have? Looking at all of you here, what do you have over there?
I guess from reading on a question about readings from Professor Flacks that is upper middle class people that were student activists. So maybe something changed.
Right, so the question was about the class background of students in the 1960s and today, and your work that I assigned, noted that mostly we were talking about upper middle class student activists in the 1960s, that the earlier period, right? And whether you believe that that's actually still true today, and yeah, if you can speak to that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I was fascinated once I got involved in the leadership of SDS, how many of the people who were really committed and had gone, and many of the people who'd gone to Mississippi, white students who'd gone to Mississippi to join that struggle at considerable risk, came from upper middle class and pretty elite backgrounds. I mean, it was quite surprising to me how true that was in the early 60s. And that became a topic that I worked on as a researcher in sociology. I really documented the first wave of student activism among white students in the 60s was from this kind of, I would say, professional and professional background parents, both including mothers as well as fathers, who were liberal, not necessarily left wing, but certainly liberal compared to maybe others of that social background. So they raised their kids with a certain degree of social awareness, social conscience. And we did a whole study of those families, student activist families, comparing them with families of students who were sort of randomly selected to match the student activists in other ways. What was going on in those different families. And in the student activist families, it was a kind of support and for the idea that you shouldn't devote your life simply to personal success. You should devote your life in some way to something meaningful in terms of social betterment, a better world, and a life that makes sense in terms of connection to the larger society. That's how parents described what they were doing to us, and how the kids described their upbringing when we interviewed them. So that was a pretty, actually turned out to be an important study in terms of understanding what I would call early 60s activism. But it was, even by the late 60s, no longer really, the movement had spread so far and influenced so many other students that distinction between those who were student activists and the great mass of students who were not at all politically involved, that broke down by 67, 68. By 1970, after the Kent State shootings of students, 4 million students went on strike for several weeks in protest of the invasion of Cambodia. And that was a huge social movement that most, I would say the majority of students in across the country were in some degree touched by. And so I guess that's really your question. And then I think once you had significant numbers of non-white students and students of more diverse social backgrounds getting onto campuses, the leadership of student activism is no longer in the hands of the sort of little sector of the middle class that I think was the formative moment for for the 60s movement was no longer really the most significant. Not that there aren't students like that very much in the movement. And there hasn't been the kind of research now into student activism that was very common in the 60s. There were dozens and dozens of studies done of student activism in that period. So it would be interesting maybe to figure out what's the difference in terms of perspective on activism between students who come from highly privileged backgrounds and become uh, leaders of social change versus students who come from more oppressed and working class and kinds of backgrounds. I think there are the differences, but I don't have data on that. Does that relate to good
So,
enough?
and Dick, I've got to let people go so they can get to class. But thank
Right.
you so much. A really wonderful talk, and thank you for taking time. And I can see on people's faces, they really appreciated having the time with you today. And this will be recorded, so you can come back and look at it. I'll share it, put it online. Have a wonderful day, Dick. We'll be in touch. Thanks to everybody who came.
Well, good luck to everybody in all of your struggles, and hope that the world is not too shitty that we're leaving for you.
Bring that with you. Carry that with you. Amen. Thank you.
Take care.